Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to Lecture 9 of the Digital Games and Contemporary Youth Culture module. This is the second last lecture and it's going to cover games, emergent technologies and social movements. Within this we'll see we're covering an enormous amount of the same subject matter from a different sort of angle. We've already covered be it gamification, digital rights, data rights, digital labor rights, new emergent technologies and the phenomenological aspects of that, such as VR, AR, and how they affect and have a knock on individual identities and the broader culture as well. So yeah, we'll just get started really. This it just kind of I'll broaden it out just to see how fast and like, how accelerated a lot of these emerging technologies are and continue to be. Someone who writes a lot about this would be Ray Kurzweil, and the main idea of the singularity, I suppose, where human intelligence is bypassed by computer intelligence, and it's argued it's already past that date. What is a key part of Kurzweil, who's also kind of a historian of technologies, is all these straight line charts essentially of human adoptions of technologies, and how this the accelerating return of that, essentially, of like how once what looks like a long sort of term project, once it begins and it starts, how quickly it ramps up speed. So for example, one of the examples he would have given is of the human adoption of the telephone, which would have taken 70 years, but human adoption of the mobile telephone only took 7 years. So there's like a 10 times increase on that. So a lot of these things point to where we will end up. Kurzweil's later work is everything kind of reduced to the nano kind of set of things really, and just how small and invisible a lot of these technologies continue to become. Where one aspect of it being a smartphone could be the size of a blood cell in 2030, which is this kind of the overriding side of his thinking, I suppose. To kind of complement that, I suppose one of his colleagues, Peter Diamandis, would he presents this statistic about Masai warrior with a smartphone having access to more information than the president of the United States had 20 years ago. So there's all these sort of phenomenological statistics or reference points to give, just to show how startling and how quick a lot of these developments from technology's point of view has been, and the adoption of these, and what they do for any sort of identity of ourselves or our culture or what we identify with, or also with just advocacy or a legal base to these things as well, and how they affect the different social movements with this. I just wanted to kind of frame it next to that to show how extreme essentially that a lot of these technologies are being driven along, and a human reaction and adoption of these technologies really becoming something quite significant, whereas before it was more of a trivial thing of an opt-in or opt-out scenario. So just a few kind of examples to that end of different sort of VR projects, or different ways of using infographics for development, education, or digital citizenship, and how that affects the social movements. We see this example there, the image on the left of the Munduruku tribe in the Amazon, and this being part of a Greenpeace VR project about defending the Amazon and all these sort of different canals and industrial systems, about being mooted to kind of to be taken on board in the Amazon, and how disastrous this could be for the ecosphere there. And on the right, just a Google search of different sort of interactive infographics. So the question here really is, what will the two new technologies deliver to age-old problems, where we can have any number of ways of having graphical interfaces for problems, but how far they actually extend to solving that problem. And likewise with the VR camera here being held by a tribe leader, how much of that is different than the same tribe leader holding another technology, be it a still camera 100 years ago or 50 years ago even, and what that actually is, how much we can actually use these technologies to deliver the change rather than to be beacons to the failure that happens on the back of this. So that it just kind of shows. I just wanted to kind of again outline how potentially instructive these technologies can and should be for the different technologies. So I just want to kind of underline the phenomenological side, where, you know, what I'd argue here is these run the risk of just being new ways of portraying and illustrating the same old problem. And what's actually new or different about that would be my kind of question really around that. And on the other side, if we look at you know, different new communities and new identities, be it virtual, online, some we would have covered in like MMORPG games, avatars, and that's going to be the crux of what I'm talking about next, of like where an identity is determined by the technologies really, or how this sort of interaction has happened and how it's happened at a lightning fast rate. So if we look at, you know, having an anonymous identity as opposed to an avatar, but essentially, you know, what is the differences between those, how much personality is in either, and how much of it is a kind of a virtual side of yourself, and how much of it's just creative and expressive. And when it comes to you know, on security issues or advocacy, or actually, you know, really involving yourself in activism, how much of that is a crucial and vital part. So it's just kind of, you know, if we look at it this, where we see the same novelty aspect can be employed, the novelty of like a colorful cartoonish image can be employed into, you know, something that's just really involving, like an MMORPG game or a computer game in general, or likewise just the blank anonymous aspect of it carrying a similar sort of weight, but also having more of an import essentially when it comes back to the real world essentially, and what could be, you know, at the other end of, you know, a user account of someone who is related to any one of these avatars or anonymous avatars. I just want to kind of show a quick video of a Twitch plays Pokemon. I'll come back and comment on it afterwards, but I'll just show it right now.
Twitch is playing Pokemon right now, and we really don't know what planet this is anymore. Starting late at night on Wednesday, February 12th, Twitch Plays Pokemon started up, giving stream viewers the opportunity to try and play Pokemon Red through the chat.
Right, but how does this actually work?
You go ahead, describe it.
Well, I'll answer that question
Sure.
I just asked. First, there's a script that goes through all the text chat and identifies button inputs like left, up, B, A, etc., all that stuff, and then passes them on to the game.
Okay.
As a result, tens of thousands of viewers are hammering at the game with inputs, which makes most of the simple challenges a huge problem.
So right now they're playing the game. They're playing Pokemon Red through the chat through Twitch.
Correct.
That's what's happening right now? Okay. As of the taping, there were 70,000 people playing concurrently and over 17 million total views in 1 week. 1 week.
We did it, guys.
No, we didn't do anything. We didn't start this.
Oh, I miss salty bets. The creator, who wants to remain anonymous for some reason, has implemented a few tweaks since the project started in an attempt to make it a little bit more bearable.
Right, they actually throttled how often the game would recognize the start command to prevent the game from being stuck in the menu for half the time, because apparently that was happening a lot.
There was an even bigger update, which is called the Anarchy/Democracy system, which was added to help the stream after being stuck in Team Rocket's maze for about an entire day.
So the Anarchy Democracy, the way this works, accepting all inputs is known as Anarchy mode, which is default. That's
Which
the way
is basically madness.
That's the way it started, yeah, and nobody was getting anywhere. So if enough people actually type democracy, it then lets the stream vote on the next input for 20 seconds. The majority of whatever the votes were in the chat then get taken and put into the game. It makes the game a little more fair.
Lawrence, what's more fun, watching people put in the inputs or watching it be randomized?
Creative inputs are fun for about 20 minutes, but when they're just walking in a circle, you start to hope for a little change of scenery, especially in the audio one.
Yeah, no, there's a different version where they just have random inputs for the game, and it's
madness.
It's like watching a rat on steroids,
It's madness.
but it's also invincible and has powers of that of a Terminator. The fallout from the Twitch Plays Pokemon phenomenon is still making waves. The chat was so congested that it was causing problems all across Twitch.
Right.
And Twitch has since moved its chat onto its own server, very similar to what they do when huge esports events from Dota 2 and League of Legends take place.
So ridiculous. So there have also been spin-offs as well. Twitch plays Pokemon, plays Tetris. Explain this one, Lawrence.
Well, they just take the inputs that would normally go into Pokemon and put them into Tetris as well, which doesn't turn out so well, but it's there if you want.
Yeah, no shit, it doesn't turn out so well. There's also the real RNGs play Pokemon, which you just talked about, which is insanity. It's just random inputs into Pokemon to see if you can beat the game.
I think if we leave it up for about 10,000 years, a computer might randomly beat Pokemon.
What is happening to us?
I want to live for 10,000 years just to see this happen.
Okay, so, I just wanted to kind of, I think this is a good illustration of a few points of the, deceptively naive sort of aspect of it, of, something looking really, really trivial and really basic. And, but it does point to, users and people, interactors or gamers essentially trying to, negotiate these sorts of technologies, or in this case, with, the resilience of the tech and trying to break it. To try break something that's being hacked, essentially, of like the games being already broken, and now the user involvement, just because the technology allows both those things to happen, that the user involvement then just, being so massive of a number of people that can kind of move in a direction to see how resilient the technology is next to that, and that possibly point to something that is entertaining. Also within that, you can see, to try get into that sort of flow sense of it, I suppose, of something that works, where they describe there of, kind of going back in and hacking out these little things. So it's not kind of caught on the start menu constantly. So within that, there is like a kind of a naturally forming rule set to kind of optimize a kind of a flow, and, applying words like democracy and anarchy to that sort of side of it is kind of, it's quite interesting as well, just to see that there is a negotiation that has to go on there with these sort of multiples and this sort of, scale of interaction, and all of it being done with, like, small little, 2D pixels rolling around environments like that, just in a game environment, kind of does explain quite a lot as well. With that, it's really, there's something about that's the collective and the technology allowing a collective to gather, share and play with it without any sort of obvious rule set, or to form a rule set on the back of that, which kind of underpins a lot of things, and different uses of the internet as such. So what I'd want to talk about, I'm going to talk about identity for a bit now, but I just want to kind of underpin that being somewhat related, that you have this sort of, we have a resilient environment where these things can happen now, and there's room for multiple sort of expressions of a person, be, as we said earlier, like through being anonymous or being an avatar, but also through how to interact with that and how to play, and the whole thing being essentially free and essentially shared. That it's an opt-in, opt-out sort of scenario, which can, all relate back to if it's fun or not, essentially. So taking that, I really just want to kind of push a little bit further with this, just an interesting quote on, from Amy Lung's book, Anonymity as Identity, Exploring Collective Identity and Anonymous Cyber Activism, which does profile sort of the anonymous movement online. But underpinning that, there's a lot of things that could relate to online gaming, or this sort of online hack gaming, or just online avatar expression, I suppose. So, which speaks of the lack of distinct structure surrounding participation on anonymous cyber activism. So, let's just remove the word cyber activism for a minute and look at the behavior, and we'll see something quite similar here. Formal membership is non-existent. Leadership is neither advocated nor desired, but are all of these individuals empowered by networks of support? How do personally unidentifiable activists develop the solidarity necessary for the formation of a collective of identity, or alternatively, is a collective identity no longer necessary for the creation of solidarity in these contexts? So we see is there's really, a lot of scope for and a lot of questions to be asked of how humans and individuals identify and then interact with these technologies, and what push the capabilities of the same technologies, and that being something which is essentially could relate to an open world game, or an online MMO game. So there is something to be, it does exist in those sort of gaming worlds now, but now the tech has just pushed it into social media, different sort of levels of like really powerful, fast computing and processing speeds that will allow massive numbers of people to kind of interact simultaneously. And this is what will feed into like the cyber activism side of it when we go a little bit further now. Just to continue this, but which process is occurring in anonymous cyber activist collectives? Has an increasingly networked society meant that solidarities are now fragmented and unnecessary? How are solidarities formed and transformed in the context of anonymous cyber activism? These are all significant questions grounding this particular study, and the complexities of online identities may mean that we must consider more integrative approaches to collective identity to contemplate the relationship between activist personality and group unity. So yet again, we can see how difficult it is to quantify a lot of this. And again, this is something that I just wanted to note earlier, because we'll see echoes of this throughout other things, especially when we speak about the anonymous movement or different sorts of current sort of cultural flashpoints to that end, where technology or social media has been, employed as being essentially weaponized to kind of, to defend a certain set of freedoms for any one side, or, to pervert a course of justice or truths, or, revising histories to the other end of it like that. When we look at cyber activism through this sort of a guise, the role of an individual who is anonymous, how they connect with a group, how they operate within that, and then also how kind of malleable that is as a set, as all the kind of the vital components of that, where we just see some sort of amorphous, collective that can form and shape at will, mostly from the perspective of it being fun in the first place, or it being like some sort of a vetting process, and then becoming a bit more interesting and essentially arriving with the real world. So some kind of, as I said, we'll show some firm examples, say from the anonymous movement in particular later on, which will back up a lot of this and show how to do it. But just to kind of, to round off the kind of the online identity side of it, I suppose, I just wanted to kind of, or the persistence and the resilience of the tech being a vital thing to allow all this, because, the internet cannot be turned off. And there's so many multiples of that, and amounts of time invested in avatars and different online personas and identities and groups and behaviors, that this is where it becomes quite interesting now, This is a still from Pearce's Communities of Play paper, and it describes the Uru live server, which ran for less than a year, and there was the community called The Gathering, which was numbering upwards of 350 at the time of a closing. She, uses this as a really interesting example of, a shared group identity essentially on the back of that, and the trauma of a server shutting down being a catalyst to kind of foment that sort of, or to sort of solidify that group identity. And what she describes happens next is essentially like, a band of virtual refugees without a game environment to be within, that they were, comfortable with, that as soon as it being closed down, and then the whole concept of them resettling into a game environment elsewhere being the question which is asked, and that being something which is quite blurs the line between the virtual and the reality when you look at that amount of investment that has gone in there. On the other side of it, we do see that, this is the note from the caption for the image here, of like players carrying the identities across the game worlds, working within the constraints of each environment's avatar creation tools. So, you see the persistence of individual players and users using the technologies to reinforce that sort of avatar identity that they had imagined in the first place, and moving en masse as a group across the technologies into a different sort of world and environment. All these things being things that are possible now, and they all do kind of speak more so to, you know, real world behaviors essentially than they would have previously in a virtual or online environment. So that's as far as I'm going to push in that direction right now with the identities side. I just want to kind of go back a little bit now and give a little bit of a history to one key part of, you know, a cyber activism movement in particular, but also just the relationship of a personal identity to online worlds and webs like that, where essentially we've had 25 years and a generation of people who are used to accessing these for free, and the essential part being it being free, or, you know, once you have a connection and you can log on, then it's free and you can set up websites or do whatever you wanted. And then on the other side of that, it's just it being free, but the push on the other side to try centralize this, and that kind of giving birth to a whole new interesting kind of side of activism, I suppose. So we'll watch the next video about the kind of origins of, or the esteems of the original internet, and then we'll see how far we've come from that.
Suppose all the information stored on computers everywhere were linked, I thought. Suppose I could program my computer to create a space in which anything could be linked to anything. All the bits of information in every computer in CERN and on the planet would be available to me and anyone else. There would be this single global information space. I would have to create a system with common rules that would be acceptable to everyone. That meant, as close as possible to no rules at all. The system had to have one other fundamental property. It had to be completely decentralized. That would be the only way a new person from somewhere could start to use it without asking for access from anyone else. Anybody could build a server and put anything on it.
He set out to build a platform that would enable people to share and link information. It was specifically designed so that potentially every single piece of information in the world could be represented on the web. Now, that's a big concept. A lot of people heard that and thought it was kind of crazy.
I don't think anybody thought it was crazy. You have to understand something before you can say it's crazy. And we never got that far.
I think people thought it was interesting.
Vague but exciting? ...
Nobody joined me and said, ooh, let's all code that up. Before the web, nobody could imagine that.
I don't think I can describe how Tim's mind works. Tim is the most out-of-the-box thinker that I've come across, and I've come across quite a lot of out-of-the-box thinkers.
So, what should I call it? I thought about the information line, Tim. That would not be very good. And mine of information would have been more, also not very, pretty egotistical, full of mesh. Mesh, just too meshy. I got it out of the mesh.
Here's option A, here's option D. What do you think, Tim? I mean, they'll always favor option C.
So I called it the World Wide Web because that's what it was. It was supposed to be global, and it was supposed to be a web.
But we said, Tim, this is crazy because your acronym, the shortened form, is 3 times more syllables than the original. So isn't this a bit, and you can't pronounce it.
We can at a distance work together, develop documents together without anything impeding us.
My first convert, Robert Caillou, then became my partner, trying to persuade people to use the web as a resource. In July and August 1991, there were from 10 to 100 hits a day. This was slow progress, but encouraging. Robert Caillou and I forged ahead and showed the web as much as possible. There was no one point when it was clearly going to take off. We never had time to sit back and say, you know what, I bet this thing's going to take over the planet. It just didn't happen. In 1993, I once again graphed the number of people who were accessing the CERN server. It was now taking 10,000 hits a day. The rate was incredible, still doubling every 3 or 4 months, growing by a factor of 10 every year. Keeping this young system on track just needed so many different things. What should CERN do about it? And should we start a company?
He got CERN to agree that Tim could take all of the intellectual property that he had built up around the web and make it available freely to the world. It meant that people could develop websites freely without thinking about who they had to pay. And probably more importantly, it meant that a whole crop of software companies could develop around the web. These were little startups. They didn't have money to pay big companies licensing fees, but they were on the leading edge of really shaping what the web looked like.
James Gleick famously called the web the patent that never was. Had Tim wanted to figure out how to commercialize it, there were many off-ramps by which he could have tried to do that, and he resolutely never did.
It was an incredibly altruistic decision to make, but I also think it was a very hard-nosed decision to make because he wanted the web to succeed.
Okay, there will be another clip from this later on. Just really, it's kind of takes a little bit of a reminder to see just when we look at the present day and this sort of golden age of the internet having passed now, and becoming a something quite pointed and that needs to be controlled. If you look at certain sort of power structures and they're taking it just that all speaks to just quite how revolutionary a technology this has been. And at the corner of that, I suppose, or right at the base of it, or as a cornerstone, this idea of the freedom of it and the freedom of access and the freedom to interact with it and interact with each other through it being such a rich and diverse thing that has allowed all that innovation. I'm not sure if it's in the next clip. I don't think it is. But one of the arguments within that is about Twitter, about if this was something which was owned and central and had to be monetized, or even Facebook to that end, they would never have got off the ground. If you think of something like Facebook and the number of a company or a product that needs 500 million users before it becomes profitable. Like, I mean, if you were making a packet of crisps or a can of soft drink and that was your business plan, it's impossible. It would never happen. So this idea of like it being a perfect sort of kind of a swamp or a pond for growing all sorts of diverse life out of it, being a vital sort of factor and a component of it, and at the same breath it being part of the take-up where there's no terms and conditions and it's something free to interact with straight away, and all that given an initial dynamism that can allow it to exist and survive, really. Again, I'm kind of going in circles, but it's all related in some way. Just to kind of go back to that, and we talk about the resilience of that sort of world in an online virtual world and how it's blurred with our everyday real world, how avatars exist in the real world and how much of a real person exists in a digital form in an avatar, and how much is really rooted and based in very simple, basic and old sort of aspects of how humans conduct themselves, be it through performance, play, different sort of novelties to interaction. Indeed, when it goes as far as, say, protest movements, and the kind of there's always been an element of pageantry, and always been an element of a carnival or a parade that goes with how social discourse has and will obviously continue to happen. Now it's just happening with new sort of mythologies, I suppose, and new sort of avatars and different imagery that we wouldn't have imagined previous. So just to kind of comment on it from that way, where this sort of flexible exchange between a digital, virtual, and a real world environment being something that's it's central, and the technology has now grown to such a scale that it allows this to happen, essentially, and again, that being something that it does come back down the line to a fun game, entertainment, novelty aspect of it for the lulz, even, and we'll talk about that a little bit further, but it does extend to that degree. To underline that, then I just wanted to show a video about data record, the data side of this, because it's digital, where we don't have, the sort of manuscript side of, or how things used to be recorded, or now they're being recorded differently through digital and online. And it's kind of like the vital part about, it's one thing to express yourself and to, have the freedom of expression and the freedom of information and the freedom of movement through virtual worlds and real worlds like that. And to celebrate all that. And all that really amounts to a canon, I suppose, of like how through the stories that we tell and the stories we collect, and that being something that's, civilizations built on histories, essentially. And likewise with, I suppose the question's negotiated, how is this going to happen, or who's going to remember wholesale for us when it comes to digital files and digital formats, where the physical artifacts are being somewhat removed and the mix between the virtual and the real becomes so transient. When do we begin to collect it, and when do we impose ourselves back onto those same stories? So just going to go to another video and come back and take up on the back of that.
One of the more disturbing patterns that we see again and again, especially with time-based media, is the problem of people being fascinated by what's next and not being so fascinated by what's just behind us. That's the old stuff. Let's go on to the new. And the result is stuff like this. I mean, nitrate decay is familiar to anyone who's interested in early cinema. But if you're interested in early television, it's a very similar problem. First, a lot of early TV was live, so there is no record. But then when it was taped, the tapes were recycled. And so programs would be taped over programs, would be taped over programs, with the result that we have very little material left from those amazing early years of television. This is a pattern that keeps repeating itself. Film, television, games, and we're there now with our contemporary media forms. I'm sure some of you have encountered this over time. One of the really intriguing things to me in doing a number of interviews before this conference was that the one question every journalist asked was the question, why bother? Why are you interested in this? Why does it matter? Why should we save the past? So I think Sandra put her finger on one of the reasons. The past is sort of the voice. It's our voice now. It's what we see as important. It's lessons that we have to impart to the world. And for a future generation, those voices should matter. Okay, that goes without saying. That's the task of history. We try to learn from the past. We try not to repeat mistakes, of course. But as a historian of beginnings, and we're now in the beginning of this moment of interactive documentaries or locative documentaries, immersive documentaries, for me, one of the real reasons is that the beginnings are the period of radical innovation, not simply iteration. So in other words, if I look back to the beginnings of cinema and the beginnings of television, what you see is an incredible plurality of possibilities. Early makers don't have rules. They don't have preconceived ideas of what the medium should be, and they try crazy stuff. And within a decade or two, the crazy stuff dies off, and one or two mainstream, usually economically backed models survive. If we think of what film is, if you ask someone what's a movie, they have a very clear idea. But if you were to go back to 1897 or 1898 or 1899 and see what people were actually making, it's a bizarre and wild and rich set of alternative ideas, most of which we've forgotten, and some of which come back later with the advent of new media like television or even today like VR. So one of the really important things about beginnings is their plurality, their pluriformality, their multitude of possibilities that will be erased. They will be overshadowed. It's like an ecosystem. Some things start to grow at the same time, and suddenly some trees are bigger than others, and they overshadow the little ones. The little ones die out, and only the big survive. Well, those little ones can actually hold the key to a future. They can hold incredible creative insights and energy and ideas. So I think my focus as a historian of beginnings obviously is on saving that innovative period. But my conviction is if we save the beginning, we'll keep on saving, because the next generation will think, hey, my stuff is just as important. So once you've established that pattern, it will take off. So A, there's a good reason to do it for innovation's sake, maintaining that spirit of plurality. But B, once people start it, it will continue. And we have, I mean, history is so rich with stuff that we might write off as crazy, but in fact, these are really the sites of amazing stuff. What to save and for whom? Crucial questions. And the what to save part is very complicated in the case of interactive documentaries, digital culture in general. If you think about, I mean, right now we're above the 400 hours per minute of video uploaded to YouTube. That's like 67 years worth of video being uploaded per day. All of us are coming from a world of books and films and DVDs. That's in all of our background in this room, and maybe even for the people watching. And that means we're used to finitude. We're used to limits. We're used to a finite amount of material. There are only so many books, and it behooves us to try to keep them. But this level of productivity is unkeepable. It requires a new way of thinking, and we have to learn to forget. We have to learn to let go. So I'm not standing here saying the inherited notion we have from the advent of the book in the 15th century until now is something we have to stick with. We can't keep everything. We've got to be strategic about what we keep and what we don't keep. We have to be very creative about how to keep. But we can't keep it all, that's for sure. And so that's a problem. That's a paradigm shift that we have to reconcile ourselves with. Our inclination will be, and you'll hear this today, and I think it's right, the inclination is to save the best, to save the things that we do this with our DocuBase at MIT. We save projects that have been in competition, that have won awards, that have been noticed in some way or other. And that's crucially important. But as a historian, I can tell you, historians are a perverse lot. They always want what's not there. It's great to go back and see the history of Academy Award winners, but almost every film historian I know is actually interested in the other stuff, the stuff that no one except Rick Prellinger bothered to keep. And we'll hear from him later today. So we have to find a way to keep both what our culture thinks is important, but also those things that could be important for a future, that we don't see the importance of yet. Those hidden gems, those hidden insights that otherwise will be forgotten. The other thing that's really peculiar to the interactive documentary form, these new digital life forms, is that in fact they're very, and I'll use this word a few times, very elaborate ecosystems. These things have research dimensions behind them, processes behind them that are not simply a product. Kat Sizek's work, and we'll hear about this later today, there's a whole methodology behind the creation of what finally winds up on the computer screen that really needs to be kept. It's part of the process. This is simply, the project itself is simply a moment. Or a project like Hollow, which has been able to build a community after the product was released. That community is part and parcel of this broader ecosystem. So this is not about keeping the book or the movie or the video. We can't just simply extend that analogy to interactive documentary forms. Actually, they're larger ecosystems, and we have to really strategize what to do about that.
Okay, again, that's a really interesting conference of lectures, not just that this is just a keynote from it, and this idea of like, how do we remember and record it, and what merits the recording when we look at how much data and technology is being produced. The interesting thing, or just to kind of point out this concept of the ecosystem of it, it does mark it out as something a little bit different to other time-based media technologies, I suppose, and kind of is closer maybe to the life of the artist, I suppose. If we look at it through a musical sense, where you just have all the different stories and all the different sort of different interrelationships that the music either inspired or were inspired by the music, catalyzed, or how they rang truths with people and how that was shared and extended. That being something kind of, interesting, where the technology demands that, essentially, if we're looking at these new sort of interactive technologies. So that's something kind of really interesting about that. And if we do think of it this way and apply it back to, you know, that earlier slide of, you know, a VR project deep in the Amazon, well, that has enormous sort of value and impact, and potentially could amount to an enormous amount of change in the now, rather than it being some sort of, you know, document or an artifact of something that has kind of passed. To that end, then, you know, just to kind of look at that of the, you know, if we think really far in the future about the likes of, you know, the NSA and the GCHQ, or, you know, as Snowden and, you know, other people would have pointed out, you know, through projects like Tempora and Prism, that this sort of level of data connection and, you know, from a surveillance aspect, does point to social control and a different sort of, you know, a power which is undemocratic, very, very simply put, and is measured by every time that information is leaked or does kind of get released. Then we can kind of get a measure of just quite how undemocratic or how secretive that process is. Whereas it should be, in the spirit of the foundings of the World Wide Web, something which is shared and is a shared responsibility to that end. But at the same breath, if we can kind of look past that, it's hard, I know, because a lot of this is really kind of vital stuff in terms of, you know, freedom of information, freedom of expression issues right now. But potentially this could be like a data bank for, you know, the internet 1.0, 2.0 in about 30 years time, which would be a living archive, you know. If we can look at it that way, or if it was allowed for us to look at it that way, that's something that could be quite interesting. But instead we just have this sort of social control element and something which just rubs against people at their very base of like civil liberties and freedoms of their freedom of their movement and their interactions and their expressions, and that being something which is buffeting up against it now. So that's one aspect I just wanted to point out. In relation to kind of in a smaller level, or, you know, just this technology is being used to kind of moot different sort of data banks, I suppose, or different sort of involvements. This is just a pilot project. There's a number of these going on around the world, but this one's just in Europe and across 3 countries at the moment, called Common Fair. And that the basic idea being a digital platform and a set of tools that can keep everyone informed about the welfare state provisions and the relevant data to that, sharing good practice and storytelling, so like a vetting kind of process built into that, and support any initiatives based on the resource sharing from bottom up experimentations. So that's a really interesting sort of concept of how we renegotiate it, and it's something which does relate back to the previous lecture on you know, digital labor rights and a holiday of how do we kind of incorporate that. Or the bottom line, even if you look at it as a web or a net, that no one falls through the web or the net, and everyone is included and everyone is given the good aspects of this as it comes across, you know. So the Common Fair project, something very, very interesting to that end. It's in a pilot at the moment, and it'll be really interesting to see how that rolls out, the support it has, and then most importantly, the problems that it comes up against, because that would be a measure of the erosions of the democratic aspects of these, to my mind. That's how I would read that, you know. Then thirdly, we look at, again, you know, just in terms of the real changes that are in the offing and are happening, and things that will change, that will, you know, potentially render big data bank and, you know, surveillance how surveillance programs like Prism and Tempora, or whatever the NSA or whatever the GCHQ are doing or plan on doing, where again we have another sort of innovation of how that something which would it naturally moves away from the centralized aspect of it, because it is counterintuitive to the technology that it shouldn't be centralized. To be collected and stored is one thing, but the centralizing of it and the control over from a central source is not something that agrees with these technologies whatsoever. So the blockchain being something which is, you know, at its very base, will kind of upset any sort of moves in that direction, because everything having a unique ID, it being fully transparent, and it also putting things like financial systems and money back in their boxes of only being one part of a whole series of interactions that people do, can and should have with each other. But bottom line being that everything is kind of transparent and traceable right back to a unique ID. And that could be something, whatever about monetary systems, could apply to, the ethics around how any food is produced, or how wine is produced and bottled and shared and exported, consumed, and then also at the end of its life, how it's recycled or not recycled. So this is another really, really interesting new sort of innovation which is happening, which will just kind of point to all that. I'm just going to kind of elaborate on it again, because it's kind of, it's still in its infancy as much as the internet was, and it's a case of where this could bring us is something that's kind of, the next set of questions essentially.
What if there's a technological advancement so powerful that it transforms the very basic pillars of our society? A technology which fundamentally influences the way that our economy, governance systems, and businesses function, and could change our conceptual understanding of trade, ownership, and trust. This technology already exists, and it's called cryptocurrency. People often think of Bitcoin as only virtual money or a transaction system. But if you look closer, you'll see that the monetary aspect is just the tip of the iceberg. That's because Bitcoin is a groundbreaking internet technology for which money is merely one of the possible applications. Money exists to facilitate trade. Through the centuries, trade has become incredibly complex. Everyone trades with everyone worldwide. Trade is recorded in bookkeeping, and this information is often isolated and closed to the public. For this reason, we use third parties and middlemen we trust to facilitate and approve our transactions. Think of governments, banks, accountants, notaries, and the paper money in your wallet. We call these trusted third parties. This brings us to the essence of Bitcoin. Bitcoin software enables a network of computers to maintain a collective bookkeeping via the internet. This bookkeeping is neither closed nor in control of one party. Rather, it is public and available in one digital ledger which is fully distributed across the network. We call this the blockchain. In the blockchain, all transactions are logged, including information on the time, date, participants, and amount of every single transaction. Each node in the network owns a full copy of the blockchain. On the basis of complicated, state-of-the-art mathematical principles, the transactions are verified by the so-called Bitcoin miners, who maintain the ledger. The mathematical principles also ensure that these nodes automatically and continuously agree about the current state of the ledger and every transaction in it. If anyone attempts to corrupt a transaction, the nodes will not arrive at a consensus, and hence will refuse to incorporate the transaction in the blockchain. So every transaction is public, and thousands of nodes unanimously agree that a transaction has occurred on date X at time Y. It's almost like there's a notary present at every transaction. This way, everyone has access to a shared single source of truth. This is why we can always trust the blockchain. The ledger doesn't care whether a Bitcoin represents a certain amount of euros or dollars, or anything else of value, or property for that matter. Users can decide for themselves what a unit of Bitcoin represents. A Bitcoin is divisible in 100 million units, and each unit is both individually identifiable and programmable. This means that users can assign properties to each unit. Users can program a unit to represent a eurocent, or a share in a company, a kilowatt-hour of energy, or a digital certificate of ownership. Because of this, Bitcoin is much more than simply money and payments. A Bitcoin can represent many kinds of property, 1,000 barrels of oil, award credits, or a vote during elections, for example. Moreover, Bitcoin allows us to make our currency smarter and to automize our cash and money flows. Imagine a healthcare allowance in dollars or euros that can only be used to pay for healthcare at certified parties. In this case, whether someone actually follows the rules is no longer verified in the bureaucratic process afterwards. You simply program these rules into the money. Ergo, compliancy up front. The unit can even be programmed in such a way that it will automatically return to the provider if the receiver doesn't use it after a certain amount of time. This way, the provider can ensure that allowances are not hoarded. A company can control its spending in the same way. by programming budgets for salaries, machinery, materials, and maintenance so that the respective money is specified and cannot be spent on other things. Automizing such matters leads to a considerable decrease in bureaucracy, which saves accountants, controllers, and the organization in general an incredible amount of time. The programmable open character of Bitcoin allows us to completely rebuild and innovate our financial sector and our administrative processes, make them more efficient and transparent, and significantly decrease bureaucracy. But there's more. In an Internet of Things, our economy will be dealing with machines that actively participate in the economic traffic. In fact, they're already here. Think of a vending machine, or drones delivering packages. These machines are unfamiliar with the concept of trust, but Bitcoin is not. Because of Bitcoin, the drone can be 100% certain that it will deliver the package to the right recipient and know for sure that it's been paid for. And we can program the vending machine in such a way that it will automatically keep track of its supplies, order new supplies from the supplier, and pay for them automatically. Of course, you'll understand that this is only the beginning. Internet technology is disruptive and breaks the status quo. It opens markets and breaks the positions of middlemen all the time. Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies have caused a paradigm shift. It's time to explore this new technology constructively and critically, and openly discuss potential applications.
So yet again, here we are with the sort of a ushering in a massive radical change, and a paradigm shift is the word to put on it, of potentials of how we negotiate our interactions with each other, our consumption of things, a transparency and a truth across all those sort of economies and transfers and trades. And then underneath all that, I suppose, just to rule out any sort of cheating. If this is a game and we are on spaceship Earth, then, no cheating allowed anymore is one sort of vital aspect of this, I suppose. So again, this is something where if we look at it from different ends, there's, banking systems moving towards this, want to move away from the word blockchain, for example, and call it like the distributed ledger space. And, there's different sort of redefinitions and co-options going on, or different versions of Bitcoin and the blockchain coming in, mostly relating back to this sort of, speed of access, speed of transactions, and trying to catch it at this sort of a level. And, that, I'll explain it a little bit later, but it's kind of, already we're kind of trying to squeeze too much in here. But this idea of, how this all relates to, an individual's freedom and net neutrality, essentially, or everyone having the same fair access to it, and not something that can be bought or have a speedier sort of version of a transaction where it happens at the same pace, in the same environment. And then the diversity of it, or the freedom to be diverse of it, is where the dynamism happens, not in the kind of who can cheat and shorthand something. So that's all kind of interesting and points to something, potentially very, very interesting with that. It's not here yet. It's still aspirational, and it's, if we look at the last slides of, the potential of collecting information, closing down sort of advocacy movements to those ends, alienating people from their identity and removing them from the body, stuff that we spoke of in like the previous lectures, of it being sort of, a doom and gloom scenario. Here, this is all kind of positive stuff, but it's still aspirational and stuff that needs to kind of come into it. So we're going to just kind of point to the, the social movements that are at play right now, and on the back of that, and the phenomenology of those, and hacktivism being one thing. This image is quite interesting. It's how to catch a self-driving car, where it's and it's kind of interesting with this, a salt ring painted around a self-driving car, and it just does not know how to compute that. And there's something kind of ancient in that idea, I suppose, of using a salt ring to collect something until to kind of keep yourself safe from it before you understand it fully. So it's kind of an interesting picture on a lot of levels like that. We're just going to take two videos from just to introduce the concept of hacktivism, and mostly where it's led to with, say from 4chan and through the anonymous movement, but also just kind of broader sort of social movements on the back of that. We'll get at this because it's going to go on.
The computer hacker group Anonymous is claiming tonight that it took down the website of the Federal Appeals Court in San Francisco this afternoon.
They took down Senate.gov servers. They've taken down HB Gary. Sony's claiming they did $150 million worth of damage.
So many confidential files that tonight, because of these hackers, can be in the hands of anyone.
Visa, MasterCard, the PayPal situation.
The criminals who hacked into Sarah Palin's private email.
The Church of Scientology says Anonymous is a cyber terrorist group of religious bigots.
Anonymous and this other group called LulzSec. They seem to be wanting to prove a point.
Anonymous kind of was like the big, strong, buff kid who had low self-esteem. And then all of a sudden punched somebody in the face and was like, holy shit, I'm really strong. I mean, Anonymous calls itself the final boss of the internet, and sometimes it proves to be really fucking true. If you are going to violate the freedoms of the internet, you certainly better watch the fuck out.
They are kind of the rude boys of activism. There's a real rough edge to them, which I think also is one reason why they garner so much love and hate from people, too. They represent a certain sort of chaotic freedom.
Individual, young, nameless, faceless folks are having geopolitical impact. I mean, it's both exhilarating to realize that and terrifying to realize that. It kind of depends on how that power is wielded.
We are legion. We do not forget. Expect us.
We stand for freedom. We stand for freedom of speech, the power of the people, the ability for them to protest against the government, to right wrongs. No censorship, especially online, but also in real life.
We have members throughout society and all stratas of it worldwide. Yet we have no leadership.
It's one voice. It's not individual voices. That's why we don't show our faces. That's why we don't give our names. We're speaking as one, and it's a collective. Good timing.
I would love to live in a country where the government fears its citizens and not the other way around. But right now, plenty of anonymous actors are in hiding because of fear of reprisals by the government. I've been called many things. There's unpatriotic.
That we're just a bunch of children sitting in our parents' basement.
I got called a terrorist sympathizer. We've been called kids, we've been called cyberbullies, we've been called hooligans, and you know, sometimes those words aren't entirely unfair, but this is a serious political movement.
No one, in the general public really seems to get it. What they don't seem to get is that the ability for Anonymous to be everything and anything is its power.
Anonymous is a series of relationships, hundreds and hundreds of people who are very active in it and who have varying skill sets and who have varying issues they want to advance and who are collaborating in different ways each day.
They're a little bit like a prism or a kaleidoscope. They've got many different facets and many different sides. Of course, when you spend enough time with them, you start to get a sort of feel or texture that's not just random, right? Yet it's very multifaceted, very rich, which does span from the quite lighthearted to the very, very serious.
Bob Dylan had a line in a song saying, to live outside the law, you must be honest. They might do something which isn't technically correct, maybe it's not legally correct, but they're doing it for purposes that in their minds at least are ethical.
People who know what they're doing, who share an ethos, who have a commitment to exposing and humiliating the man, who have a very low tolerance of lies and what they perceive as evil on the part of overweening power structures. They share information, they share tools and techniques, and they are currently having a very good time.
The hacker culture, as we know it, really sprang from one place. It was MIT, and it was specifically the people in the Model Railroad Club, the Tech Model Railroad Club.
Hacking originated as humorous pranks. When the guys at MIT put a Volkswagen up on top of the dome of the building, and people woke up and saw the car up there in the morning, or they measured a bridge by the body lengths of somebody. I would say his name was Brian, and discovered the bridge over the Charles River was, 822 Brians. These are funny things. That's where hacking originated, and it migrated into engineering and computer communities. It's witty, it's pranks.
Basically, Microsoft and Apple both got their entire start off computer crime. Bill Gates stole pretty much all of MS-DOS. Steve, Jobs, he was creating boxes to defraud the phone company,
I always saw hacking as implicitly political. Hackers, whether they're conscious about it or not, whether they're explicit about it or not, make a statement about how we should treat information. And some years after my book came out, one of the people I wrote about, Richard Stallman, got very publicly and explicitly political about software. And he believed that software should be free. Free as in freedom, not free as in beer, as he put it there. Behind it, whether misguided or not, there's a political impulse.
I'm Chris Weissopel, former member of the Loft. We don't necessarily say hacking group because it makes it sound like we're hacking, so we used to call it a hackers think tank. Hacktivism was a term coined by a group called Cult of the Dead Cow. The Loft had an interesting relationship with the Cult of the Dead Cow. Actually, there was some members that were in both organizations. And we kind of kept like the serious security research that they would do under the Loft name. And if they were doing some sort of just goofy stunt-like things, they would do it under the Cult of the Dead Cow name. Because the Cult of the Dead Cow was really kind of sort of like a propaganda type of organization. They had a guy who was the minister of propaganda. They're kind of merry pranksters. Like everything they did was completely over the top. One of the guys there coined the term hacktivism because he saw one of the things his group was doing, which he called hacktivism, was writing software that people in other countries could use to communicate securely, even if their government was spying on them. So the principle was really, it was freedom of expression. It was everyone should have access to the internet. Everyone should be able to communicate and get their message out on the internet. Even more important in countries where there was repressive regimes, that if you said something against the regime, they would come and take you away, and you weren't saying it anymore.
Hacktivism is often meant to designate a form of political activity in which technology assistance is used for human rights activism. That's kind of the narrow sense of the word. It usually stays within the purview of the law. Usually, because by providing technological assistance, you may be breaking a local law, however. And yet, other forms of digital interventions, protests, dissent, disobedience are clearly pushing the boundaries of the law, are seeking to actively break the law in protest, or are just merely transgressive as well.
Just like in traditional activism, it spans the full gamut from sit-ins or pickets to actually spiking trees and pouring sand in the engines of construction vehicles. I mean, there's real sabotage. The same thing does all fall under the hacktivism label. There is a spectrum.
A good place to start are with what has often been called virtual sit-ins, which use the tactic of a denial of service attack.
Denial of service has been around for a long, long time. The equivalent of like if you for some reason wanted to disrupt a bus service, right? You can hire 1,000 extras to all go and like line up at the bus station, right? And get on the bus. And so then anyone who was really trying to get on the bus couldn't do it, right? It's as simple as that. When you stop trying to visit, website goes back up, no permanent damage.
Okay, what we see from the documentary there, that snippet from it as well, I'll send a link there, it's well worth watching the whole thing, is just how steeped and linked in, more traditional protest movements this all is, in terms of like people, the activism of it, and just the kind of the techniques and strategies involved in it. What is really different here is the effort and ease that these things can be achieved, and the technology delivering this en masse so that things can happen at scale and happen at speed, and just that sort of dynamic of it being something which is super interesting and also quite defining of the time. where this is all arrived from is like the 4chan forum, and in particular be like one of the platforms on that, where, you know, freedom of speech and freedom of expression being like the vital component of it, and all of that arriving in whatever amount of crass, you know, elements of violence or just absurdity of it, or, you know, anything that would just, you can express it, and the worse the better. And that being a celebration, a platform to celebrate the freedom of speech with that. Where this all kind of came to the fore, where Anonymous formed with the Scientology is one aspect covered in that documentary there very well, but and that just shown something where, you know, it became a very principled stance and something to move in the direction of, you know, refusing to be closed down and refusing to have your freedom of expression curbed. On the other side of it's this image here we're looking at is like related to Gamergate as such, of a split in and a divide in those sort of forums and chats and communities in terms of you know, the freedom of women to express themselves, or, you know, just their role in gaming and criticizing, critiquing game culture as a whole. And the inbuilt assumption there is that this is something which is male dominated, and, you know, something which should be left alone for them, which is, you know, inaccurate in the first instance, and secondly, inappropriate in terms of how it was all handled next, of, you know, everything become crasser and cruder, and essentially a community turning those same freedom of expressions on each other, mostly from an inaccurate base, I suppose, of, you know, thinking that that's an appropriate and acceptable way to treat and speak about women and target them in particular. So we can see again that there's just, this is how massive the that platform is as a tool, and just how I suppose the anonymous aspect of it, or the kind of the different takes on that sort of community, allowing the expressions to become more extreme and more divisive as such, and is fed right the way through from, you know, into current alt-right movements in America in particular. And this idea of the lulls versus truth-seeking versus fake news or true news, and these sort of elements being at play, where it's all sort of somewhat interchangeable, because everyone can be anonymous. The side of it, you can choose what you want to invest your time into or not. Everything having like different sides to it. So what is actually, you know, the right side, or who is just becoming somewhat of a chaotic, confusing sort of scenario in some degrees, and the extremes of it, and just I suppose bringing it right the way through to the cultures of hate and intolerance that it breeds, being the most inaccurate sort of aspects of it, and the kind of the really damaging parts of the same freedoms of expression, you know, to the tune now of, like, you know, attempts to rewrite some sort of histories, and, you know, a real radicalization of people in terms of, like, you know, nationalism, or white nationalism in particular, and all these things which have kind of, you know, are very damaging and mostly inaccurate, and not things that belong next to lulz. You know, and this is all, I suppose, the kind of the game aspect of that does continue, of this sort of experiential thing into the real world environments, is much the same as Anonymous wearing masks like that. But it's the same breath we have like Breitbart being, you know, the big paper for the alt-right, being kind of met at every step by other Twitter accounts like Sleeping Giants, who want to remove the advertising from that same magazine, and all this happening in the domain of Twitter. So there's this still sort of, like, you know, tit for tat or game sort of exchanges going on throughout all that. Again, this is something for future historians, and, you know, to look at the myriad of this, but mostly the kind of the really interesting and rich sort of paradigm shift in human behavior in relation to these things. The only thing missing really is you know, you know, a tolerance of people with that, and a really you know, an understanding of what is the freedoms at stake here, and who's being denied who, rather than the attritional sense that it seems to have come from now, and just this sort of like centralizing of the things that you can see the rich diversity of. These are the real questions that will have to be answered pretty soon. So I'm not going to go too much further onto that. I just wanted to kind of comment on the sort of the state of play with the, you know, that sort of almost avatar kind of quality of arriving in the real world on the side. Once we, you know, we looked earlier at the pageantry side of things, and now we're looking at like the warrior side, or, you know, the notional warrior side of an avatar like that. And it's the same thing where, you know, you can get your kind of apparel and, you know, look like a meme, or look like, you know, a certain sort of avatar in real life running around in, you know, running battles in right-wing rallies, or in rallies in general, you know. So all this stuff seems to have kind of just seen this sort of merge between the virtual and the real coming full tilt, and, you know, one behavior kind of justifying another. Back to Tim Berners-Lee then, because, you know, this is all I just wanted to kind of mark at that sort of context of the extremities of that, and how divisive and hateful all that is, next to the altruism that came with the original internet and the build for it, and, you know, just his own life experience really, which is the most important thing of like this idea of, you know, applying imagination to it, rather than it being some sort of deserving privileged stance that you can now deprive other people of their access to it. So these are kind of big concerns that are, you know, rearing their head daily when it comes to this, and much when we talk about the, you know, social control or the centralization of that, things that are at total odds to the original build of the internet and the original design of it. Indeed, Tim Berners-Lee's working on his own version of the internet to kind of work against the kind of, you know, keep the net neutrality at stake, that is at stake, keep it, you know, something that is sacred to it, and it will allow for, like, you know, the next iterations of it, with projects like Solid and, you know, socially linked data and these sort of concepts that are kind of, I suppose they kind of echo the blockchain and different ways of looking at that, and how information is stored and disseminated being something that you know, a user can decide, rather than you know, some sort of service provider, or, you know, something that's easily kind of intercepted. So this sort of edging towards a uniqueness of these things, and that should kind of underpin the central freedoms of it. But it really does hark back to like how people use it, and, you know, that kind of honoring the freedom and diversity and richness of sharing experiences through it. There's just one more short video from the Tim Berners-Lee documentary, and then I'll be back to round it off.
For the last 25 years, whenever somebody's asked me about what my biggest fear is, I think I've always said that some company or government or combination should end up controlling the web.
The internet has always treated every customer the same, but this morning the net neutrality principle faces a historic change.
Abandoning net neutrality would threaten to end the internet as we know it.
Benefits want net neutrality! 85% of Republican voters want net neutrality!
How would I explain net neutrality? Yeah, it's not very easy.
Yes, net neutrality. The only two words that promise more boredom in the English language are featuring sting.
People hear the word net neutrality and their eyes glaze over, but this is truly important.
Net neutrality is that all content travels at the same speed. It should, neutral. Well, and it has. It has from the beginning.
The way that the web works today fits the definition of net neutrality.
The web is like a highway. Anyone can circulate freely, and it doesn't matter that your car is a Ferrari, it doesn't matter that you are on a bike. There's certain regulations just in place to keep things flowing in an efficient way. Now, think about a place where, because of what you're driving, you will be forced to take a different highway that is more restricted, that has more checkpoints.
That doesn't make sense, because we have one road system. It's really important. You can go from anywhere to anywhere. The idea of making it dependent on what sort of car you're driving is just crazy.
Imagine a country of 10,000 cities where you can only visit 5. That's the same when you lack net neutrality.
There are new fears Washington may take that wide-open superhighway and turn it into a toll road.
The FCC is endorsing new rules that could clear the way for a two-tier system. It would allow websites to buy faster service.
The rules would open the door for the first time for internet providers like Comcast and Verizon to charge tech companies to send content to consumers more quickly.
So now people with money will have more access than people without money.
Oh,
And the whole idea behind the internet in the first place was that everybody has equal access. It's not just for rich people. Everybody has access.
Offering fast lanes and such could create a world where content providers that already are big and have big wallets can write checks, and those that are small might be told, you're not worth our trouble.
If this had been in place all along, what innovations do you think we wouldn't have now? I'm not sure Twitter ever gets started because the cable company will say, Twitter, how's this going to make money for us? Forget it.
In developing countries, it becomes critical because it can make the difference of someone living forever in ignorance and poverty to someone accessing knowledge even about their rights.
Russian authorities have blocked access to over 100 websites.
Raif Badawi published a website promoting free speech, sometimes critical of religion.
Raif Badawi was sentenced to a total of 1,000 lashes and 10 years in prison.
There are lots of threats, and as the web has become more powerful voice of the people, more powerful instrument, that power has been resented by some governments.
A key tool for the protesters in their fight for democracy here in Hong Kong is the use of social media. We're seeing people everywhere using Twitter, using Facebook, Instagram.
But there is a fear that maybe the Hong Kong government will cut reception.
Nearly 40,000 websites are inaccessible in Pakistan, including YouTube.
Tens of thousands of protesters marching in Hungary. They're upset about a plan by the government to tax internet use.
I think things are coming to a head. The stakes are bigger than they've ever been. The rules of net neutrality, the rule that this only works because it's a neutral medium, isn't sufficiently well instilled. The World Wide Web is celebrating this month its 25th anniversary. So I've got a question for you. What sort of web do you want? We should think more about our constitutional right. It's our right, in the sense of a human right, to be able to wander around the web. The web is our new world. We need to be able to go wherever we want. Let's crowdsource a Bill of Rights for the web. How about we do that? How about we decide these are, in a way, becoming fundamental rights, the right to communicate with whom I want. What would be on your list for that Magna Carta?
Team is leading the very start of a movement to protect this public good that is the open web, because it's not too late yet. Team was the one opening this gate, this portal in time. We had a small opening in power structures, and that was the web. Team opened the possibility of anyone to make anything happen on the web. Now the clock is ticking, and this small gate in time and space is closing. When it's closed, and we will have an internet that is more similar to television. You know? It is up to us, and it is difficult, but we are several millions.
Do me a favor, will you fight for it for me? Okay, thanks.
Tim believes more than anything else that good things happen in the world when people work together. That's how he made the web happen.
The debate over internet regulation has led to a record 3.7 million user comments directed at the FCC, and less than 1% of those comments were in opposition to net neutrality.
They took to the streets in their tens of thousands, and their voices have been heard. Hungary has dropped plans to introduce a tax on internet use.
In Mexico, the government's bid to tighten control over the use of internet is triggering anti-censorship protests. The backlash has been so intense that the country's ruling party is now backing down.
The ayes have it.
The Federal Communications Commission today voted 3-2 for net neutrality.
As the outpouring from 4 million Americans has demonstrated, the internet is the ultimate vehicle for free expression.
This is actually the third time the FCC has tried to pass a net neutrality rule. They've been trying this for 12 years. In the last couple of times they've tried it, they've done it in a way that wasn't legally sustainable.
We will keep emailing, we will keep writing, we will keep fighting for nothing short of real net neutrality so that it's protected forever.
The openness of the internet allowed me to build the web. The openness of the web has allowed people to build all kinds of things.
Okay, big clipped at the end there, but that's that's kind of brings that side of a full circle, just in terms of the diversity on offer and should be on offer, from the freedom to even that, just to kind of underline that sort of, this is where we conduct our world, so it's the freedom to to move around and speak and express ourselves how we want, and how that's being defined or decided democratically rather than something which is being imposed, being the vital sort of next test of all these things. That's I've run over again, sorry about that. It's as you can see, there's just quite a lot to fit in here again. Next one is the last one in this module, games in youth work setting. We're basically going to attempt to bring all this full circle, and well, mostly just to provide different sort of tools and materials and starting points. There's a lot of kind of relevant discussion points here for young people in particular, with everything that's been discussed, mostly in terms of like the digital rights aspect of it as well. As I've maintained from the outset, and will continue to, that they, but they're below the voting age, mostly under 18. Yet they are the first advocates of these new technologies and the first adopters, of these new technologies. So they need advocates, and mostly critical thinking in terms of how they use them, the tolerance to allow other people to use them, and to respect other people's use of them, and to move away from something which is more, divisive and hate-filled and intolerant, and really to look at where the real risks and perils to that freedom of expression come from, through the centralized sources of it, rather than other users and people who do play games, do interact and entertain and have fun on there as well, and want to express themselves as well. And for all that to just kind of really take into account the solid foundations that this has come from, both technologically in terms of the likes of Tim Berners-Lee and the others before that, but also from where history has delivered us to, and not to be taking steps backwards in terms of accepting people and the diversity of people, rather than imposing simple, narrow, and sometimes misguided agendas. So anyway, that can all be taken up elsewhere, as I'm sure it has been. And that's me. See you in the next lecture. There'll be links attached to this, and any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Okay, thanks, bye.